We have a real treat for you this evening, Dr. Neil Postman. Neil Postman has achieved international recognition as an expert in semantics and communication theory. He's chair of the Department of Culture and Communication at NYU School of Education, and for 11 years served as editor of Etc. He's a contributing editor to The Nation. A native of Brooklyn, Professor Postman began his career as an elementary school teacher and then a high school teacher, and he moved on to the university. As a professor at New York University in English education, he established an esteemed reputation in linguistics and semantics. Prior to becoming New York University chair, he taught the history of technology and its social effects. He founded the graduate program of media ecology at New York University. Dr. Simon is the recipient of the George Orwell Award for Clarity in Language and the Distinguished Professor Award at New York University. He has authored 18 books. Among them are the 1960s classic Amusing Ourselves to Death, his most recent book, The End of Education, and tonight's topic, Technology, the Surrender of Culture to Technology. Through the years, Neil Postman has spent endless hours researching the social consequences of television, and he says this is what has made him a skeptic of technological progress. In a spring 1996 issue of Social Policy, Professor Postman said, quote, 20 years ago, no one would have been interested in this kind of discussion. Now you can really draw a crowd. There's an audience out there waiting to be organized to exercise pressure in making sure that we think a little more clearly on these matters. People have begun to sense that there's something really not quite right about making all your aspirations related to bigger and better technology. As predicted, there's an audience out here, eager to hear what Neil Postman has to say. 6 weeks ago, we were totally sold out to standing room only. I bought my ticket in August to make sure that I'd have a seat, and I can't wait any longer to hear what he has to say. So please join me in a warm welcome for the distinguished and controversial Dr. Neil Postman.
Tucky said to me about 10 minutes ago, what would you do if I referred to you as Neil Simon? She said, would you lose your mind over it? Well, she did. Did you notice that? Yeah.
This gives you a brief bio of the man, Neil Postman. That was a clip from a lecture delivered by Postman on March 11th, 1997. The link to the entire lecture can be found in the show notes to this podcast. Technology itself has become a national religion, says Postman, which people take on faith as the solution to their problems. Technology has become a religion. Perhaps you've never thought of it this way, but we can easily see the correlation. After all, a gift and blessing of technology is its problem-solving ability. In many ways, our technology pushes back on the curse of the fall. Glasses can help us see. Medical advancements can save lives. Automobiles can rush us to the ER. Countless technological advancements have become the solution to our problems, and in so doing, have subtly become saviors we bow down to. In 1985, Postman wrote the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. How do you measure a book's impact? One metric would surely be the fact that people are still reading, referencing, and discussing it 40 years after it was published. More specifically, a book is clearly impactful when a group of people decide to write another book to honor its legacy. And this is exactly the case with the forthcoming book, Scrolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. We referenced this book in an earlier episode of this series, and we'll get plenty of airtime talking about this book in episodes to follow. For now, here's some of the contributors talking about who Postman was and his influence. You'll first hear from Brett McCracken, who's been a part of previous episodes in this series. He's on staff with the Gospel Coalition and served as one of the editors and contributors to Scrolling Ourselves to Death. So Brett, who was Neil Postman?
Yeah, Neil Postman is looked at as kind of one of the 20th century's leading public intellectuals in the area specifically of media, kind of theory, media studies. He was based at NYU. And he was a professor there for a long time and kind of, I think he started the media ecology program. And just a prolific author. He wrote a lot of books that, made a significant impact. I think the first book I read from him was Technopoly, which is one of his great books looking at how technology can, move from being a tool that we use to becoming, something that uses us more. Things can get out of hand. But he's most famous for his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which came out in 1985. And he was really kind of taking the baton from Marshall McLuhan in terms of the idea, Marshall McLuhan's famous adage that the medium is the message. And so looking at kind of a critique of media that really focused on the medium itself and how it changes discourse and how it's not just what you say, but how it's said and on what format and what media form and how that changes things. So Amusing Ourselves to Death he was writing it kind of in the 80s and the Reagan era, the peak kind of the TV, the heyday of television. And so the primary kind of medium he had in view was television, but he makes a really compelling case that, television changed discourse in very perceptible ways and kind of reduced everything to the same plane of you had the weather report next to a human interest story, a feel good story next to a report about genocide in Africa next to a horror, and so television is just this medium of amusement and entertainment that kind of trivializes very important things. That's essentially kind of his big idea in Amusing Ourselves to Death. But it's a book that really impacted me in my own formation as a critic and as a thinker of culture. And he is Jewish, so he's not writing from a Christian point of view, but I think he comes from a Judeo-Christian mindset. So he has kind of a sense of there's moral absolutes and certainty. So I think there's ways that Christians can really empathize and find a lot to agree with in the way that he looks at the world. So that's a little bit about Neil Postman.
Jen Pollock-Michelle. I am a writer and a speaker, and I live in Cincinnati with my husband Ryan and our two boys, Andrew and Colin. I actually was living in the western suburbs of Chicago at the time, and Reed Mercer Schuchart, who you said actually was a previous guest on the podcast, was delivering a series of lectures at College Church in Wheaton. And we did not attend College Church, but we had friends who attended College Church, and our friends said these were just really excellent lectures and you should listen to them. And I did, and I think they really completely shaped my convictions and commitments about technology before I even had a smartphone in my hand. I mean, these were actually, I interviewed Reed recently, or I wanted to kind of quote the lectures. I still have them, but I didn't have the date. And I couldn't remember if it was 2008, 2009-ish, 2007. It was somewhere around then. And I actually can't even remember now what we decided upon. But he basically in the lectures went through a history of technology and just, kind of did it very easily, I mean, for all that he knows, how he was able to sort of distill. I mean, it wasn't like a history of technology starting with the wheel or anything, but, basically media technologies, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Telecommunications. And it was great. And I think especially to be able to be delivered in a church setting where, there are these shared, so it's not just it's not a history lesson. It's not just information. It really is situated in the most relevant questions of like, how are we going to decide how we use these technologies? What will be the values and commitments that will inform those decisions? And I think, and because Reed Mercer Schuchart was a student of Neil Postman's at NYU, I mean, I just sort of followed that thread, and I think I read Amusing Ourselves to Death. And then I actually really like Technopoly too. So I just want to put a plug in for Technopoly. Those are the only two books that I've read, but there are definitely books that I've really read and sort of sat with. And I think the arguments are incredibly compelling, especially when you think about how long ago they were written, that he's very prescient, ominously so. So yeah, my introduction was Neil Mercer Schuchart with those college church lectures.
Now you heard Jen reference Dr. Reed Mercer Schuchart, and he's someone you will hear from more in just a bit. But let's hear from one more person before we go to a break of, again, who Postman was, but why are we still talking about him today?
My name is Colin Hansen, and I serve as the Vice President for Content and Editor-in-Chief of the Gospel Coalition, and also am the Executive Director of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. So my responsibilities broadly cover all the different kinds of resources that we produce for churches and for individual Christians around the world. So that ranges all the way from books and articles to podcasts and videos. Where I was at the time, I studied journalism, so that connects in. And then I went to work immediately for Christianity Today. And around the Wheaton College area there in Chicago, there are a lot of people engaged in media ecology. So Postman was a pretty common name for me to be able to hear. And so I picked up Amusing Ourselves to Death at some point in that sort of self-study, professional development, realizing that everybody's quoting this book. I need to see it for myself and understand what Postman is saying, what McLuhan is saying about media in general. And it really struck me as insightful for all of the reasons that people told me that would be. I guess in some ways it's like reading C.S. Lewis for the first time. You're thinking, he can't be that good. Everybody's quoting him. But then you read him for yourself and realize it's pretty good. He knows what he's doing here. So I remember that in that course. And because of my background straddling journalism, the academy, and the church, he really brings a lot of those things together because in part, he directly addresses theological issues in church history. And that's part of what I undertake in my chapter is specifically him talking about Martin Luther and Jonathan Edwards in his book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what do you think it is about his message? Why are we talking about it today? Why is it still something that's just resonating with 2024? And, by the time this comes out, I think it'll be 2025. Yeah.
Well, I guess I go back to something we can all relate to, which is the shutdown in 2020. And I think about how it was a really big deal, but at some level, because all of us are so conditioned to engage the world through media, it didn't necessarily strike us as nearly as drastic as it would have previous generations. So much of our life is already mediated. The way that we learn is mediated, the way that we entertain ourselves through television, the way, of course, we've taken that 20 steps further with the internet. For many people whose jobs, like mine, does depends so much on a mediated experience. The change was significant, but not, like I keep saying, not nearly as dramatic as it might have been otherwise. And so I think Postman gives us words to understand why it doesn't feel to us necessarily like everything has changed. But if we watched a video of a group of people in our situation in life from 35 years ago, it would look very different. And of course, Postman goes back further, of course, to talk about the television revolution, which is his primary anecdote. But I'll give you one of my most significant takeaways in applications from Postman. It came from a presentation that we did years ago for a Gospel Coalition council meeting. And it was with a well-known Christian writer on technology. And he was talking about the significance of the smartphone. I think the year would have been around maybe 2016, something like that. Maybe it was a little bit earlier than that. And afterward, there was quite a bit of grumbling. I think people thought the presentation, some people at least, thought the presentation was maybe overdramatic or pessimistic. And one of my colleagues walked away from that meeting and said, yeah, I don't understand why people are so up in arms about smartphones, because after all, we have televisions and people used to warn about that too. And I stopped and responded and said, yeah, actually, now that I think about it, it had to be 2016. I said, people predicted that, or we wouldn't really have any more debates about ideas in our presidential elections, and that you would be elected not because of your abilities to lead a country or expertise, but simply because you were famous for being on TV, because that would be your primary job. And boy, none of that's happened, has it? I mean, part of why he's so insightful is because he describes the world that we live in before it happened, or as it was happening, early stages. And so you can have presidents like Donald Trump, presidents like Ronald Reagan, and I'm not disparaging necessarily their ability as presidents, simply pointing out that one of their primary qualifications was they were good at acting a part on TV. In Reagan's case, it was, literally a politician in some cases, or football coach, but kind of a genial authority figure. And with Trump, the whole, no holds barred boss who can really whip everybody into shape. That's, they, regardless of what their abilities are, they can perform them on TV. And so Postman anticipated that this would be what would happen through the 1980s and 90s as television continued to displace so much of written media.
We'll be right back.
I'm Walt Mueller at the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, and I'm excited to invite you to the 3rd Annual Northeast Youth Ministry Summit held in beautiful Ligonier, Pennsylvania from March 17th to 20th. We're excited to partner once again with our youth ministry co-workers at Reformed Youth Ministries to co-sponsor this 4-day youth ministry training conference. This year, our theme is Changing World, Unchanging Word. We've put together a team of 26 experienced speakers and trainers who will lead, encourage, and equip you with theological depth and faithfulness as you experience rich community. You don't have to be from the Northeast to attend. In fact, last year we had attendees ranging in age from 19 to 77 who came from 21 states and 3 countries. You can get all the information on the Northeast Youth Ministry Summit and register by visiting nymsummit.org. That's nymsummit.org. I hope to see you in Ligonier in March.
It's interesting to hear from accomplished authors as they share the impact Postman had on each of them. However, I was actually able to talk with someone who knew Postman on a personal level. And just to put a finer point on this, we're talking about a book that was written over 40 years ago. We've heard from individuals who've been impacted by Postman and his book. In many ways, his influence is hard to measure. Now we get to hear from someone who actually knew Postman firsthand and share some great stories about this man.
Yeah, my name is Reed Mercer Schuchard. I'm Associate Professor of Communication at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. I've been here since 2007. And I live in the town of Wheaton with my wife, Rachel. And we have 10 children and 9 grandchildren, and 5 of the children are still at home with us. I was in college as an English major, and my mother heard a sermon preached by Terry Johnson at the Savannah, Georgia Independent Presbyterian Church, in which he quoted from Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and he quoted page 9 from the pulpit that the second commandment of the Decalogue was a strange injunction to include as part of an ethical system, unless its author assumed a connection between the forms of human communication and the quality of a culture. And she said to herself, well, I raised Reed with a television. I bet he'd like this book. So she bought me Neil Postman's book, mailed it to me on campus, and I read it, and it blew my hair back. And so then I got his next book, Technopoly. And by that time I was just graduating and just married and was down in Savannah, Georgia. And I threw the book across the room several times before realizing, wow, this gets under my skin so much. I've got to see if this guy's, still alive, still teaching, and what do I have to do to become a student of his. So I called up New York City's, 212-555-1212. And I said, give me the New York University Department of Culture and Communication. And they did. And they put me through to Neil Postman directly. And he has this very great smoker's, very gravelly voice. Hello, this is Neil. And I was like, a fanboy. I just couldn't believe it. I'd gotten him on the phone. I'm like, this is Neil Postman, the Neil Postman, the Dr. Postman that wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death and wrote Technopoly, like the book that changed my life. And I'm just kind of spastically frothing at the mouth. And he says, I don't have all day. What can I do to help you? And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm literally just delighted to have reached him. And I've forgotten why I've called. So then I'm like, come on, brain, think. What did you call for? Just to, exclaim your love for this guy's books? And I said, what? And then it just kind of came out. I said, what do I have to do to become a student of yours? And there's this long pause on the phone. And I think, oh no, maybe it's a dumb question, or maybe he's already retired, or maybe he's sick, or I don't know. But there's a long pause on the phone. And then he says, well, traditionally, in a case like this, the first thing you would do is apply. And I said, oh yeah, of course. Great. Where do I apply? What's the name of the program? And what, it'd say, it'd be the master's degree in media ecology in the program of the Department of Culture and Communication at the Steinhardt School of Education, and so they connected me. I applied, and then, that was it for the next 10 years of my life. I was just a disciple of Neil Postman. Now, he died after 8 years of studying under him. I was in New York at NYU from 1995 to 2005. He died in October of 2003, but he was the one who personally invited me to join the PhD program after I finished my master's degree in 18 months. So without that, I would have never applied. And I didn't even know, at the time, what does one do with a PhD? I didn't know that meant I was signing up to be a college professor, but I just wanted to study under him as long as possible. So when he invited me, I, jumped at the opportunity. He was just a kind old soul, and he had sort of, these are the last 8 years of his life. He died at age 72. And he had a lifetime of teaching and a lifetime of stories and a lifetime of observing, media from, he was born in 1931. So from the 40s until 1995, basically saw the world move from the radio to the internet. Wasn't there for the smartphone drop or for social media. But in my opinion, if you read Technopoly, which he wrote in 1992, that is still about as authoritative a statement on the where technology is taking a culture that embraces it as anything else. And if it's not the most authoritative in the ultimate, academic sense, it's still a fantastic starting point. And I think anybody can read it, from high schoolers to retired people, because Postman's study and careful assessment of media forms gave him a really profound insight, which was that, and he taught us this, he said, always, when you write for the ear, not for the eye. And so if it sounds good, it will be good. It'll make sense to people. They'll be able to hear it and they'll want to read it out loud to other people. And so everything I learned about public speaking, everything I learned about writing, mostly I learned by sort of watching and trying to imitate Neil Postman as best I could. And he was a really masterful storyteller and teacher and communicator. He wrote his books and he wrote his speeches on yellow legal pads. And he would give the talk and then make an aside and say, oh, that reminds me. And he would go off on this digression. And then he would return to the main point. And you would think, wow, he's just got all these stories. And he's just so masterful at weaving them back in to the main thing. But how does he do that? And it wasn't until years later that I saw one of his legal pads and I saw, oh, the digression is part of the script. And so he was very much, a raconteur and storyteller. And he knew just at a sort of gut level that the dialogue and the conversation and the storytelling was key to generating an audience. And so I just love reading his sentences because they're so readable. They're so hearable. You can hear his voice when he's writing. If you watch any of the videos of his presentations on YouTube, he's got a very unique, like I said, gravelly voice from a lifetime of smoking, which by the way, he did all the way up to the end, even though he died of lung cancer. But he was an avid basketball player and played right up to the end and was quite good. So he was a great influence in my life and was a terrific lover of the word. And even though he was not himself a devout or religious Jew or Christian in any sense, he took religion seriously as a necessary sustaining narrative for a culture. And he also said in an interview once that was recorded on videotape that he said he didn't know if God had spoken or not, but he chose to live his life as though he had, because he feared that if he didn't, he would lose his way. And so he was quite open to religious questions and religious answers and religious narratives. And so, it was strange to me that as a young Christian, I had become a Christian at 22 while at Swarthmore College. And by the time I was 25, 26, 27, I was surprised that he was inviting me to join his PhD program because, most graduate schools in the secular world are kind of a classic Marxist worldview with a materialist, reductionist, atheistic sort of set of assumptions. And so they typically wouldn't want an overtly or explicitly and outwardly expressive religious person in their ranks. So the fact that he invited me personally to join his program was always something that made me go, wow, that's very unusual, because he knows that I believe, in the Christian gospel, and he knows I'm not just a sort of casual church attending, believer, but an actual devout believer in this story. So it was always an enjoyable give and take we had in the classroom and just in private conversations about life, religion, and the meaning of the universe. So after several years in grad school, my family started joking that I was just going to maintain my status as a graduate student, and that graduate student was my chosen vocation and profession and calling, that I had no intention of graduating. and they weren't too far from the truth, because as long as he stayed alive, I would have enjoyed being under his teaching.
In talking to Reed, I asked, as he got to know Postman a bit more, did he ever talk to him about that initial nervous phone call he made when he fanboyed over him?
It's very funny. I did a year later, after I had, established myself as a good student and ingratiated myself into his care and, proven that I could do the work at the master's level. It was about October of the following year, when I was in my last semester of the master's program. I came into, I said, Dr. Postman, do you remember a phone call you got about a year plus ago from a very enthusiastic young guy calling you from Savannah, Georgia, about, just how much your books changed his life and what did he have to do to be a student of yours? And I don't know what he meant by his answer, because what he said was, well, Reed, I get a lot of phone calls. And so I don't know if he meant, of course I remember what an idiot you sounded like, but I'm not going to make fun of you. Or if he actually just didn't remember it. So either way, I thought he played it very graciously.
Yeah.
And that was his style. He was always very gracious. Yeah.
Well, and you say in the book as well that not only, I mean, you talked about being invited to the PhD program, but you were invited to lunch in the faculty dining hall. And I'm just curious how that seems like that would be a rare thing. And yeah, just what was that experience like?
Well, I mean, again, he would leave his door open. And so if it was shut, it meant he was having a meeting, but he would leave his door open so you could walk by and see, is he there? And so there were several graduate students in the master's and PhD program that would love to have lunch with Neil Postman. So we would linger and hang around at lunchtime and see, oh, is he in there? So does he see me? Is he, so I think I only went to lunch with him once, just the two of us, but it was one of those days where I was just out of a class and I was just checking my mail in the grad school, in the mail slots in the grad department. And I walked by and there he was. And he said, "Oh, Reed, what are you doing?" I said, just checking my mail, And he said, "Well, do you want to go to lunch?" I said, "I'd love it." So he took me up to the faculty lounge upstairs in the top of one of the buildings at NYU. And we had a great lunch. And I don't remember a thing he said as I recount in that chapter. I was just so just delighted to be sitting and eating lunch exclusively with Neil Postman, that the only thing I remember was when he got back and he pointed to the door of the Department of Culture and Communication. He said, "Well, we named it that because we thought that was a big enough umbrella under which, we could study anything." He said it'd be like calling it the Department of Man and Woman. What doesn't that include, And that's literally all I remember about the lunch is the coming back from the lunch. It's like sort of like a return to Earth after being in outer space in orbit for an hour.
Well, and the way you're talking about him, I mean, you're saying kind of the last part of his life. It sounds like he was somewhat of a celebrity at this point in his life. He was lecturing all over.
And I was probably one of his biggest fans, and it was something I didn't become aware of until later. That even though I was an enrolled graduate student of his and was seeing him on a weekly basis in class, I was also following his public career as an intellectual. And so when he would come out with a book, I would go to the public reading and signing of the book at the Barnes and Nobles in New York City, where he would have the readings. And I would sit down with a ton of other people, and I'd look around and I'd be like, wait, I'm the only student that's here. Where are your other students? Why aren't they interested enough to show up for these events? And he said, "Oh, that's, it's two different lives, and, it doesn't matter. It's no big deal." I was like, well, don't they want to read what your latest, And so I think I was much more enthusiastic about just what his latest thoughts and ideas and writings were than I was aware of until kind of retroactively looking back on, oh yeah, I was a bit of a fanboy and, a kind of gaga over this person's mind. But again, I don't regret any of it because he taught me so much.
Well, it's interesting as you're saying that, I'm thinking, maybe this is a segue to scrolling ourselves to death. It would be hard for students now to have a professor that was publishing like this and lecturing like this and not knowing about it through social media.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And so how were you keeping up with what he's doing? Because, I mean, yeah, you didn't have social media. I mean, the internet, all those things. How were you discovering if he wasn't really talking about this in the classroom?
I would see posters in and around New York City. By 1997, the internet was a mass medium. And so if that's a good question, did the posters for his readings get put up in the department, or I want to say it was posters that alerted me to this, but it might've been simply that the school would publish an upcoming event of any of its professors just as a general announcement to the student body.
Sure.
That, hey, look, one of our professors is going to be doing something outside of the school walls and you should know about it. So I was always attentive to those and very engaged in, part of it was just being in New York City for 10 years and being in graduate school. It was a great pleasure to go out with friends and hear an idea presented in a public lecture or a debate or a panel. So we went to a lot of those, whether it was Dr. Postman speaking or not. So it was just one, I think, I want to say it was on the Upper East Side, but it was somewhere in Manhattan at a Barnes and Noble that I looked around and I realized there's no graduate students here. So I was there early. I was in the front row, and I was like, "Where's everybody?" You know?
I just love to hear Reed's firsthand testimony about Postman and the admiration he had for him as a student. His appreciation for Postman gives me a desire to know more of his work. As we begin to close this out, I want to bring us back to Brett for a few more minutes. As he was initially sharing about Neil Postman, he paused to allow me to speak, but I could tell there was plenty more to share about Postman's influence on him. To give him more time, I followed up with the same question I asked Colin Hansen. Why are we still talking about Postman? Some of this we've already answered, but here's what Brett said.
I think it's because he is largely seen as being correct and prophetic in what he was talking about in 1985. Not only was it true in 1985, but it became even more true. You know, he was writing this before the internet was really a thing. It was just kind of being formed, you know, in the 80s, and it didn't really become a thing until the 90s. And yet the internet, I think, really accelerated a lot of the things that he talked about in Amusing Ourselves to Death. And even the way that he leans a lot on Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, and that kind of approach to dystopia, where you're hooked into this constant feed of entertainment, you know. If you read Brave New World, it's this dystopia where, you know, we are basically dying. We're amusing ourselves to death is what's happening in Brave New World. And Postman, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, basically makes the argument that 1984, so George Orwell's prediction of dystopia was more oriented around like a top-down control, like information control. And that was how society was going to collapse, was through kind of a top-down, very heavy-handed, big brother approach. Aldous Huxley's vision of dystopia in, you know, Brave New World is more about like, we are opting into this ourselves. We, as consumers, it's our instinct to want to kind of satiate our consumer desires through this kind of mindless, constant stream of intoxicating entertainment. That is ultimately what is going to render us powerless, because we're just kind of floating through life, you know, hooked onto the IV drip of entertainment. And I think that's where Postman and Huxley were absolutely correct, because the smartphone world is exactly that. You know, we all walk through life literally hooked to these devices. Mm-hmm. If you go anywhere in public these days, you know, and I do this often, when I'm speaking about these topics, I always give people kind of the challenge. Next time you're in a coffee shop, next time you're in a, you know, waiting room at a doctor's office, or like at a bus stop, or just walking anywhere in a city, look around you, and the vast majority of people are looking down on their phone. They're filling every open gap in their day with this device that they're just like, they're hooked onto, and it's not for any clear purpose. It's just like out of habit. You're like entertaining yourself constantly. You're texting, you're listening to a podcast, you're watching something on YouTube, you're texting, you're emailing, whatever. And so that's where I think Postman is so relevant today, because we were amusing ourselves to death in the 80s with TV. But how much more so are we amusing ourselves to death now, when it's not only like watching TV for a few hours at night, that we're doing this mediation, this entertaining ourselves constantly throughout our day from start to finish. You grab for your phone when you wake up. It's the last thing you look at when you're about to go to bed for most of us. Mm-hmm. And throughout the day, anytime you have a chance, you're doing something on your device. And so I think most people see Postman as very right on the money with his predictions. And if you Google like Neil Postman was right, that quote, there's just like tons of articles and like, you know, commentary pieces over the last few decades where people are recognizing that book has really stood the test of time, because it's, you know, it's dated in some respects, but in many respects, his principles and the points he was making have never been more relevant.
Now, there was a lot to wade through there, but I want to be sure you heard this. In answering this question, why are we still talking about Neil Postman? Quite simply, because he was right. What was he right about? To borrow Brett's example from Huxley's Brave New World, we are a people who are controlled not by pain, but by pleasure. And it's this idea that Orwell, Huxley, McLuhan, and Postman talked about so long ago that describes the world we're living in now. We are a people controlled by pleasure. More on this next week. You've been listening to Digital Christianity by Reformed Youth Ministries. For more information about our summer conferences, youth leader training, and resources, visit rym.org. If you would take the time to leave a positive review and share this podcast with others, it's one small way to help our ministry. Stay tuned to the RYM podcast for more great content that seeks to serve the church in her efforts to reach and equip youth for Christ.